What's up guys, it's JD from JDTechGear and welcome back to the channel where we discuss PC passion, tech reviews, unboxings, and setup design. So if you're into that sort of thing, consider subscribing and checking out the rest of the channel. So this is the CMT 510 from FSP. I'm sure you guys have heard of FSP now. Their products have made quite a few appearances on the channel. They make pretty good coolers in my opinion, but here's a different dynamic today: PC cases. As you can probably tell, this is nearly an all tempered glass panel case, which definitely suits the theme for 2017. I don't mind tempered glass just as long as it gets airflow. The Raid Max Sigma is a good example of the blend of glass and airflow. Anyways, it's 491mm long, 208mm wide, and 448mm tall. It's a decently sized case, but a little compact for the ATX form factor. This case supports ATX, micro ATX, and mini ITX boards, a CPU cooler height up to 160mm, a VGA card length up to 400mm, three 120mm fans in the front, or two 140mm fans, and up to a 360mm fan. I mean, radiator, not a fan. That would be ridiculous. Anyways, one 120mm or one 140mm at the top, but I wouldn't try sticking a radiator up there since the clearance between the motherboard, heatsink, and top panel is literally right next to each other. Lastly, there's room for one 120mm fan at the rear and another one for the bottom of the case. There's two SSD trays in the front and another two trays in the rear, which can support an SSD or an HDD up to 3.5 inches. This case also comes with 4 Rgb fans, which is the most fans I've seen a case come with, so it's pretty awesome they came with that. With that being said, there's a lot of wires that come with them, but the fan hub in the back is nice, and then you can plug all of them in right there. But unfortunately, it does not connect to the motherboard, so the fans operate separately off a multi connection that powers the fan hub. The front I/O has two USB 3.0 ports, headphone and mic jack, power and reset button, and the reset button controls the RGB fan lighting functions. You can take the reset connector and put that back into the front I/O connections on the motherboard if you want to, but it's already plugged into the fan hub when you purchase the case. The accessories kit comes with the PSU mounting plate, a baggie of screws, 4 zip ties, and the manual, which is honestly a little underwhelming for a $100 case. My Fantex Ento Pro came with an assortment box for the screws, and I paid $100 for that case. But anyways, that's pretty much it for the primary features of this case. So there's a total of 3 tempered glass panels. All 3 were pretty good quality and relatively thick. They were well packaged too, with plastic wrapping on both sides of the panel, although the tempered glass warning sticker doesn't come off completely upon removal, which is kind of annoying. You'll need to get rubbing alcohol to properly remove all the remaining residue and whatever is left of the sticker on the glass. For panel removal, just unscrew the 4 thumb screws and unhinge it. You don't need to worry about the panel falling out because there is a groove for it to catch on both side panels. The primary side panel has a matte border for handling, while the rear side panel does not. It's also tinted much darker and you can't really see the components in the rear. I mean, you can see it a little bit, but not much. I don't mind it because I just shoved all the cables in the back and you can't see them, so the tinted glass in the rear is pretty nice. So it kind of just acts like a mirror, so it's an aesthetic choice really. For front panel removal, it's a pain. There's a total of 4 screws to remove from the case, and each side has 2 of those screws. You will need a screwdriver to unscrew them, since the screws need to be completely fastened down to secure the front glass panel. Also, you will need to put the case up on its back so that the front panel is facing up. This way, when you unscrew it, it doesn't fall off. The front panel removal is really a pain. On the flip side, there's a magnetic dust filter in the front, and there's 2 other dust filters, one for the PSU and the other for the bottom fan. Those dust filters, however, are not magnetic. For a $100 case, I would expect a better design for the dust filters on the bottom. The magnetic one in the front is just fine. And so here's what the building experience looked like, and here's a little B-roll for ya. Building experience with this case was fine. I didn't come into any issues with installation or clearance issues, although when installing the GPU, you have to unscrew the cover plate with the 2 screws and take that off. Then you can unscrew the 2 slots or however many slots that you need to install your peripheral devices. So that just seems way out of the way to install a GPU, and I just prefer the standard method of unscrewing the thumb screws. This method is overly complicated. I mean, I think it could be much simpler. The Raid Max Sigma had a similar design, but it used a thumb screw and a plate that slid over to the side instead of having to take it completely off and unscrewing 2 screws. And that was much easier than this version. The only other minor issue I had was when I was plugging in the CPU power connector. It was really difficult. There's not much room for a hand to go in and reach back into that corner. Other than that, the build experience was fine for me. Cable management with this case is adequate. There's a good amount of options to route cables. There's about 19 millimeters of space on the rear side towards the motherboard. And on the other side, there's about 30 millimeters of space, but this side also houses HDDs, which can definitely get in the way of cable management. There's no hard drive cages, so they would have to be mounted here instead. Surprisingly enough, I was able to work the cables around my hard drive that I installed, so it wasn't too much of an issue. There's cable cutouts in all the right places by the front fans, by the CPU power connector, the front IO, and the GPU. Although the cutout for the HD audio is cut off by the power supply. Some may argue that you can snake the cable behind the motherboard, but the soldering points on the back of the motherboard may puncture the coating and short the board. So I'd rather not mess with that. I'd rather just have it drag across a different cable cutout. So you would either need a smaller form factor power supply or just drag it alongside the bottom of the Psu Shroud like I did. Not much of a big deal since it's only 1 wire, but it is worth mentioning. Also, the GPU power cable is a little bit out of alignment for the GPU with the Ssd tray partially covering the cable cutout, but again, I bypassed this by working with the wire and making sure the other connectors on the wire didn't pop out. Very minor detail, but again, worth mentioning. The only real problem with the cable management, and I'm sure you've noticed by now, is the empty wall on the Psu Shroud on the bottom of the case. Just like the Corsair 570X, at least I think that's the right case, you can see all the cables underneath. Almost defeats the purpose of the Psu Shroud. It would have benefited greatly if there was a wall there. It doesn't even need vented slits or anything like that to vent any air over to the power supply, since the power supply has its own supply of air from the rear of the case, so you could just have a standard solid wall right there. So I really don't know why it's there. It's not a major issue since the case is so pretty, it distracts from that aspect, but you know, it's still there. Lastly, there's no rubber grommets, which is a huge disappointment. A case for $100 should most certainly have rubber grommets. Any case that's $60 or over should really have them, in my opinion. I feel as though there have been a lack of rubber grommets in the case market this year, but I mean, what do I know? There are cases with rubber grommets for like $70, so there's no reason why this shouldn't be here. Regardless, without the rubber grommets, the cables still look good. Managing the cables were not an issue, and they ended up looking pretty clean for me, especially since I just shoved most of the cables in there and I just spent about 25 minutes on cable management. Now, how are the thermals for this case? I tested the Ryzen 1400 at both stock speeds of 3.2 GHz and an overclock speed of 3.9 GHz, and used the FSP Windows 6 as the heatsink. Running IDA 64, we got temps for 39.63 degrees Celsius at 3.2 GHz and 55 degrees Celsius for 3.9 GHz. The ambient room temperature was about 22.22 degrees Celsius, so these numbers are surprisingly respectable. There is a minor gap for the front panel airflow, but I can't imagine it getting much air through the front, to be honest. Also, the included fans are 120 millimeters, but the actual blades are smaller than that of a usual 120 millimeter fan. Regardless, this case did a good job at cooling. Would I recommend placing higher thermal output chips in here? Probably not, but for the Ryzen family and any other low thermal output chips, this would do just the job. Noise output for this case isn't bad either, since it's all mostly glass. It shields a lot of the noise output. The resting decibel level for the room is about 39 decibels, which is near silent, and for the idle noise output, it's about 40.6 decibels, which is actually really silent. Under load, it isn't much louder at 42.3 decibels, so the case is relatively silent. Overall, for $100, it's a mixed bag for me. The included fans are RGB, but they're limited to static, breathing, flashing, and off, and they only run off the Molex power provided by the hub. You can plug the 3-pin connectors into the motherboard, but you would need 4 separate fan headers on your board to power them all. You can't daisy chain them. Although it is nice that the case does include 4 fans. That surprisingly worked well for this case despite its narrow passageway for airflow through the front. The front panel removal is terrible in my opinion and complicated, especially with installed components. The cutout on the Psu Shroud on the bottom exposes all the wires into view and detracts from the appeal of the case. The included accessory kit definitely needs to be updated, not just a bunch of screws placed into a single package. Some sort of organization would have been really nice. There's no removable top panel, but you can place a fan up on top. And the GPU installation, you have to unscrew the rear plate to install anything into the PCIe slots. And this is a big and, there's no rubber grommets. A case this tier should have rubber grommets despite the inclusion of 4 RGB fans. Luckily, the inside still looks pretty clean without them, but I feel as though they cut a few corners with this $100 case to be worthy of $100. With that aside, most of the cable management was easy to work with. I probably spent about 25 minutes managing the cables. The 4 included fans are a very nice addition and worth keeping due to the noise and thermal performance. You have room to fit a thick radiator in the front. Removal on the side panels is nice and easy. And lastly, the case looks absolutely stunning. It's a sharp looking case, very minimalistic, very professional looking, definitely an eyepiece and more of a piece of furniture than a PC case in my opinion. Not a bad thing, of course. I can stare at this case for a while admiring its beauty. Looks aren't everything of course, but the low noise output and decent thermal performance also make this case appealing and compelling. But the negatives that I've listed above also make it a mixed bag. For $100, the value is questionable for me. It depends what your situation is. Do you not want to pay extra for fans when you buy a case? Do you need the rubber grommets? Do you want a very attractive looking case on your desk? Do you want optimal airflow? All valid and valuable questions, but this case checks a yes and no at almost a 50-50 split for me. So I can see myself buying this case and I can also see myself passing it along. It would definitely depend on your situation and mine as well, but regardless, it looks clean and it looks awesome. You know, the negatives definitely are there to keep in mind. It's just undecisive for me and depends on the situation. I think with some tweaking to the design of this case, it can be a complete beast. Otherwise, it can leave some to be desired, at least for me. Links to this case and the build will be listed in the description below for both the US and UK. Hope you all enjoyed the video and found it helpful. Thank you all for watching. Remember, if you want to see more content like this, consider checking out the rest of the channel and subscribing. I'll catch you guys in the next one.